So let's get underway. So we have an hour and a half set aside for this one, just to give us a little bit more freedom to explore some of the issues that might come up today. This event is actually part of a larger program that we're running at Jisc along with partners, Advanced HE, Emerge Education, and Universities UK, called Learning and Teaching Reimagined, which is something which is aimed primarily at senior leaders within higher education. If you are a colleague from further education today, or from another part of the sector, then you're still very, very welcome, and I'm sure a lot of what we're talking about today will be relevant to you, but you might find that some of it leans a little bit towards HE, and that's sort of a deliberate part of our planning. But if there are questions that you want to raise for afterwards that are to do with different parts of the sector that perhaps we don't cover today, then we're very happy to keep conversations going afterwards. If you want to find out more about the Learning and Teaching Reimagined program, because there are a series of events coming up, we've got another one coming next week, which I'll tell you about at the end of today's session. But there's also kind of links to kind of forthcoming guidance and resources as well. I'm just going to drop the link to page in the chat down the left-hand side. So please do use the chat window at the side. The watchword for today really is that this is not one of those sessions where you're going to be spending an hour and a half listening to people talk. There'll be a little bit of that, but the main point of this session is really to give you all a chance to get together with peers from across the sector that are perhaps dealing with the same issues that you are when it comes to managing a safe return to campus. So we've got Ashley Hargrave from Coventry University, who's going to be telling us a bit more about their experiences later on. I'll introduce Ashley properly as we get into it. But if I just edge this on, just to show you what the plan for today's session is. The main body of this session will be for me to host a discussion, looking at three kind of key areas which we highlighted in the blurb when you signed up for the event. So we're looking at kind of what innovative steps we can take in order to make sure we can manage a safe return to campus. Maybe identifying what pieces of established practice, digital or otherwise, will need to change in order for that to happen, and what infrastructure and processes need to be put in place to facilitate all that. We might find actually that the questions that you've got are very different, and if we need to go a little bit off piste with that, then that is absolutely fine. One person that is also on this session is Christine Gormley, who is effectively our reporter for the day. So she's going to be paying close attention to what we're talking about, what goes into the chat, and what people say on the microphones as well, because we're going to be producing some form of guidance, some form of report at the end of this about kind of how the sector is looking at this particular section. So the more open you are, the more questions you ask, the more you're happy to contribute, then hopefully that means the richer the discussion, but also the more detailed the resource that we can provide at the end of it. So I'd just like to extend my thanks to Chris Gormley for joining us to do that. The ways that you can engage today primarily is through the chat window. So please do say hi in the chat and say what organisation you're from, and maybe kind of what your role is as well. I might also be asking just to kind of check how people are from time to time, but just by asking you to give me things like a little icon or a little emoticon. The way you do that is up at the top of the screen, you'll see that you've got a selection of buttons up there. One of them, which might look like it's a person holding their hand up, with a drop-down box next to it. If you click on the drop-down box, you see you've got a number of different options. I'm afraid I haven't put any jokes in today's session, so the laughter icon may be a little underused, for which I apologise, but thank you, Jeffrey, for laughing anyway. But there's also an agree and a disagree button in there as well, so we can use that as a shortcut for things. But just to check that everybody's got that, could you all just give me a green tick? We're cooking on gas, as it were. Okay, I think that's a sufficient number of. We have a quorum of green ticks there for me to be happy with where we're going. Okay, let me just start very quickly asking you, and this is an exercise to go into the chat. Just to kind of see where we are with things. I'm wondering if you don't have to identify your organization, but can you sum up in a sentence or a phrase what your organization's intentions are for the next academic year when it comes to campus reopening or otherwise? Is it full? Are you going for a full reopening, hoping to get back to what it was like in 2019 as quickly as possible? Are you going for a no, we're staying completely closed? Is it somewhere in between? What does it look like? What does it look like for you? Okay, so thank you very much for these coming through. So, it's interesting. The term hybrid learning is actually I hadn't really come across it before coronavirus. It might seem a little bit odd, given that we're supposed to keep our fingers on the pulse of online learning. But it's the way that people talk about hybrid learning and what it is, as opposed to blended learning. That's a conversation which has become a lot more rich over the last couple of weeks. So, but hybrid learning is that kind of mix of kind of a double strand of some of it happening online, but people making the choice about whether they want to engage online or face to face. We've got a mixture of things like blended learning and 2-meter distancing. Jeffrey pointing out that the messaging is a bit mixed. Different pressures on different parts of the organization, perhaps different visions about what's going to be achievable. That's very interesting. Thank you, Jeffrey. Helena talking there about trying to manage expectations about what's achievable with 2-meter distancing and multi-mode teaching. Just somebody was typing that. I'm going to crack on just because, although we've got an hour and a half, time is actually quite tight for this session, so I am going to move on. Just to give you a bit of an idea about the scope or the purpose of this webinar, when we called it Managing a Safe Return to Campus quite deliberately, sort of aware that particularly if you're on Twitter quite a lot, you might notice there's an awful lot of argument and disagreement and heartache about some institutions around the world that are pressing ahead with fully opening campus. And justifiably, a lot of people are very concerned about what the implications are for that on people. So, the safe return is kind of the watchword for us. We're looking for ways that we can help to facilitate a return to campus working, but in a way that is going to protect the well-being of staff and students and be responsible, socially responsible. Just to kind of let you know where the idea for this webinar came from, we're sort of coming full circle a little bit because a number of weeks ago now, the subject specialist team within Jisc was sort of aware that lots of people were at the stage of planning their next academic year, but trying to do it without much of a format or with a lot of confusion. So what we did was we thought, well, we'll try and get together an idea for people about kind of what are the main topic areas that people should be looking at, and maybe some of the areas of evidence that you could be checking. So that you've got, I'm putting together a checklist, which we duly did, which I'm going to just drop into the chat now. Which was always a first step to something. It was never really intended to be the final word on something, and what we wanted was to create a resource where people would be able to kind of take it on and contextualize it. And that really is where our contact with Ashley Hargrave started. Ashley, as I said, is from the University of Coventry and has been deeply involved in planning for the return to campus next year in the form that they want to take. So we thought it would be a really good opportunity to hear from Ashley about her experiences, not necessarily about how they purely about how they looked at the checklist, but actually what's what's the story been like for them? What lessons are they learning there? And I think actually one of the things that you were quite keen to emphasize when we talked, when we were planning the session, was that you didn't want to come along and try and put across the idea that you had it all sorted. This was much more of a kind of a work in progress and an opportunity for discussion. So I think without further ado, shall I hand over to you, Ashley?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ashley Hargrave, as Chris introduced. I work in Coventry University. I work as a member of a business process management team. My role is business process management specialist. And in my normal day job, pre-COVID, I worked on a number of teaching and learning initiatives, which were around improvements in teaching and learning. And really, as the world has changed for all of us, my role has really become very focused around COVID. And that really started from late February. I had a holiday in Sicily, and on my return, I was told it probably wasn't so good to come into the workplace because COVID was really kicking off. Obviously, Italy had gone into lockdown, and that as a team, we were going to start to focus very much on COVID-19 and looking at what we needed to do, because we were aware at that time that the UK might be going to the same situation as had just happened a week or two before in Italy, with the closure of schools, colleges, universities. So I'd come back from Italy, seen that situation, was coming back to what I thought was my normal job, and immediately I was one of the first people who needed to actually self-isolate, not because I had symptoms or was within a vulnerable group as such, but because of the risk of me actually carrying the disease back to my team and my colleagues. So part of my first piece of work was really to investigate the impact that COVID could be having on the institution, what we would need to do for campus closure. And as part of that piece of work, I came across the work that was going on within Jisc, and subsequently sort of built the relationship with the team here around the checklist. But if we just go to the next slide, please, I'll just explain. My background is I've worked previously in further education. I've worked as a secondary school teacher. I've worked in conservation. I've got kind of quite a broad range of experience. I've also worked in private sector on kind of business improvement. But with this piece of work, we're all completely new to it. It's everything in this is different from anything you've ever worked before on in terms of a change project. And obviously, it's a very stressful and difficult time for colleagues. It's a very difficult and stressful time for students. So there's a whole myriad of smaller projects and work that went into this, which I won't detail today. But what I do want to try and give you a flavour of, and obviously I want to learn from everyone on this call as well, is really share a little bit of the experience of what we tried to do as Coventry University Group to pull it into a format that means that we can kind of measure and look at the change and try and get our arms around the size of the task. But I also want to really hear from other people and what resources and skills and what people are doing, because I think it's just at this time, I think we all just need to work so collaboratively together. And just to answer Chris's initial question as well, because I'm conscious I haven't touched on that, we're actually planning to return to campus based on a hybrid or blended teaching model, but quite a small number of teaching hours, certainly between September and January. It's 5 hours that we're looking at across the board. And most lectures will be held as online, but the sessions that will be prioritised in those 5 hours are really sort of smaller kind of seminar pieces or hands-on activities. So just to give you a flavour of that. So I came across the checklist that was being used, and it immediately enabled within the team that I'm working and the work we're doing, we could start to kind of compartmentalise some of the actions that we needed to take. So the checklist, if you've used it or seen it, was initially very much about campus closure and moving sessions to online, and also ensuring from the health and well-being of the student, the staff and the student, very much that health and well-being services could also be delivered online and that staff could work effectively from home. It covers all of those areas. And so what we looked at in terms of that was how we could take that content and kind of ensure that it made sense for individuals working at both operational and strategic level within Coventry University. So we basically went through it as a team of 4 of us. We went through and we've co-written it with consultation with our relevant stakeholders. So within the team, we've taken different strands of it. We've checked it against UUK and the Jisc principles. We've got our own Coventry principles as well, which we've checked it against. And the reason why we've done that is within our structure, which is large and complex, we're not all Coventry University is a bit of an oxymoron because we're not just based in Coventry. We've got a campus in Scarborough, we've got 2 sites in London, we've got a new site in Poland. So we really needed to look at all of our services, all of our staffing and all of the activity, ensure that we had something that was robust and could be used across the piece. And it was also important that anything that needed to be escalated and couldn't be resolved at operational level could then be escalated to the right forum so that it went to our group leadership team and it was given the sufficient attention that it required. So to ensure efficiency, we were trying to make decisions as much as possible at the right level with the people that needed to be involved, ensuring we'd mapped all of our key stakeholders and essentially ensure that the work was effective in that way. If I just go to the next slide. So we developed, as a team and in collaboration with colleagues, we developed this sort of overarching framework, and we've seen it as essentially 2 really key aspects. One is preparing our community, and we see our community as both our staff and our students. So preparing our community, our staff, our students, our wider stakeholders, which include obviously employers, for example, where students have a placement, preparing those people for our return to campus in this phased way. And also in terms of infrastructure, that's all of the kind of health and safety, the kind of areas that sit with the estates, etc. So it's your building alterations for social distancing and your provision of your IT, all of those. So we saw it as really this massive exercise of kind of gathering and reviewing the data, which is in a really complex format. So we were sending out spreadsheets, were getting sent out to kind of gather information about teaching, gather about which staff need to return by when, which services needed to have staff on site, things like when we had research labs, when we first went into lockdown, who needed to come in and access buildings and when. So all of this very complex data was being gathered, including things like surveys from our people team, which is our HR team. So a huge amount of coordination was going into that, and then trying to sort of consolidate it into something that was meaningful to each area around the management of their safe return, to then check back with them that content and make sure that it was meaningful and understand it from the point of view of what they needed. So across this, we've been looking at it as essentially pillars as well. So the pillars of our education and student experience, our research work, and our enterprise and innovation. And then going across those strands, really our communications and engagement, our staff and student welfare and support, and then trying to ensure we've got some level of behavioural and procedural change built into it as well. So quite complex. That was really initially trying to build this around the closure of campus. But now what we're trying to do as we go forward is to plan obviously for the return to campus as well, and in a phased way. And I'll come on in a bit, we're actually starting to look as well about if the situation changes. So there's not probably time in this whole session to go through in a lot of detail, but just to give you an example how we use it to assess, the thing that I liked about the checklist when I first started looking at it, and Jisc had first developed it, was it actually gives you some way of having a criteria for what you want as your end state. So in terms of kind of talking to people and facilitating those discussions, it's about how do you see that end state? What does that look like? The small example I've put on here is about student placements. So if you imagine on our current checklist, we've got something like 150 to 200 line items. What we're trying not to do is to get down into the minute detail, but keep it to things that are quite major. But this one, which is about student placements, as a simple example, is just obviously in the normal world, pre-COVID, students would go on a whole range of placements and had those opportunities. Similar to like other institutions, there's a no detriment policy around exams. Similar to that in terms of our student experience, we wanted students to still have the opportunity, if they could, to have some kind of placement or to use that time to use online working. So we've essentially developed as the final objective that there's a clear guidance for all students. So the overall objective for that is we've got clear guidance, it's been written, it's been agreed against the guidance that it should be, and that everyone knows the situation, including the students, staff, and the specialist teams that support around placements in the normal practice. So that then has an assessment which is 1 to 5 by whether or not the end state has been achieved. So essentially it can be 0, or if it's 5, obviously everything is complete, everything's known, communication's been sent out, staff and students have been briefed, everyone knows what they're doing. Obviously we have a lot of items that are not in that state at the moment where they're complete. We're still working through it. But it does give a way of focusing the attention operationally at what needs to be done. And like any sort of project or change, you then know what items are becoming more red in a certain time scale and what needs more attention or what needs more sort of senior guidance around it. So that's the way we're kind of working at the moment and trying to kind of carve that up across groups and meetings and forums that were already in place and that own those areas of work. So in terms of our progress to date, what we have done is we've done a huge amount of gathering and reviewing data across the team, both which in I work and also across other teams. There's a lot, as you can imagine, and I think it'll be the same in all institutions, there's a lot of work and energy. And for some people like myself, their day job has become all consumed with planning around COVID. Other projects have been put on hold. So what we have now is we have got a governance structure. We've got this framework, which I've explained a little bit about. We've socialised that framework in the way that we're working across multiple teams, and we've aligned the checklist with key teams. We've also looked at our risks and our existing projects within our group project management office. So looking at the existing projects that were running pre-COVID, which ones are still running, how the focus of those has changed, and how some elements of COVID are being incorporated into those projects. We're also starting to look at, but it's at an earlier stage, something called an alert level, which is essentially government guidance that we have about if the situation changes from a public health point of view and we move back up into full lockdown, how that will impact on our teaching models, how it will impact on our service delivery, and how we might need to quickly go back into the situation essentially that we had in March. So doing some planning and some trying to kind of get a base level of obviously where we want to be in September and as we move forward, but there is a bit of socialisation that we can't expect, that we won't have to move backwards. So some of that alert level is socialising that idea. So in terms of the work, we've got all of this activity that's kind of gone on through various teams. We've also got a lot of communications that are going on, which go out through various forums and through various teams, including through things like our roadshow, which happens at Vice-Chancellor level through regular roadshows and communication. But the questions and answers that come back in from those sessions, we're using to analyse how people are feeling and sort of evaluating that work as well. Room repurposing is going on. So risk assessments as well has been a big area of work. So in terms of where we are now, our communication and reporting, with strategic reporting to group leadership team. So anything as it becomes the issues that rise to the top and are read, they're being fed through, and there's escalation routes. We're looking to develop that further into sort of a dashboard, which has just the objective, the criteria, the timescale, and the RAG status against it, and really then highlighting what resource or help we need, making that really clear. We're starting to look at if we do need a second way of planning and what processes. So we've reviewed the processes we put in place in March when there was a lockdown. We're starting to review how those are going to be used again in September and what we need to do if we need to go back into another lockdown situation. And in terms of our next steps, it's essential we just keep driving the conversations in the appropriate forums, and that we get everything sort of signed off in terms of our organisational framework, and that we ensure we've got the senior leadership team reportability. So all of that's kind of in flight at the moment. The thing that we haven't really had a chance, because there's just not been time, and one thing that we think we really need to prioritise is this lessons learned from the first lockdown. We've literally just not had time or capacity as a team, and that might be again another area that we can feed into the forum as we go forward. It would be really nice to hear lessons learned from other organisations as well. And essentially we've got a lot more work to do on improving our processes and aligning best practice for that safe return. So we know we're doing as much as we can, but we know we've got a long way to go, and it's that preparation if there is a second lockdown or localised lockdowns. Because we've got campuses in London, we're aware that obviously the situation could be very different in London than it is in Coventry. The R rate could be much higher there, and London could be much more affected. Or obviously we're very close to Leicester as well, so we're just aware that we do have a risk that the situation could change, and change very rapidly. But we've formed close relationships with our public health team within Coventry City Council, and we're taking advice, and we're going through monitoring and advice from them. So that's the end of my formal bit of the presentation. I hope that was helpful.
Thanks very much, Ashley. Yes, yeah, it was indeed. We do have obviously some time for questions and a bit of reflection on what you've told us there. If people want to drop a question into there is a Q&A box just below the slides there if you want to use that. But given that the numbers that we have here is nice and manageable, if you would want to ask Ashley a question using the mic, then that would also be great. If you want to do that, if we could ask if you could put your hand up, which you do by using that drop down button from the emoticons at the top, that would be super helpful. I can see that some people are typing in there. Observation from Mark there. So local lockdowns may also affect students from different regions who study at the same organisation, which I guess it'll be true for Coventry, that you have people from outside of an area that might then be quarantined and locked down, which gives you sort of an added layer of complexity over this, I would guess.
We do, yes. We actually have got a high number of students who commute in as well to Coventry from
Mm-hmm.
surrounding areas. So Leicester, in terms of their local lockdown, we do have students who commute in from Leicester,
Mm-hmm.
um, travel back on a daily basis. So yeah, that's certainly something we're aware of. We have also, as an institution, made a decision that students, if they choose, they don't want to come in for the 5 hours of face-to-face contact, they don't
Mm-hmm.
have to. So that's their decision. And obviously, if a student finds themselves having to self-isolate because they've got symptoms or a member of their household has got symptoms, then we have got a reporting route and support for students in that situation.
Yeah.
So yeah, so those are some of the things that we've had in place for some time
Okay.
since the first lockdown.
Thank you. Just while I know some people are typing and while other people are thinking, there was just something which occurred to me while you were talking, Ashley, which was about sort of end states. And also I was reflecting a bit on what Jeffrey Vernon had put in the chat earlier about mixed messages across campus. And I just wonder whether you've found that the expectations that different parts of the university, whether it's students, whether it's kind of different parts of different departments or different services, whether there is, or there has been quite a wide range of different expectations about what's going to be possible and what's desirable, and how have you managed that, or how's the university tried to kind of manage and equalise all that?
There's certainly different expectations, as you would expect. There's different feelings around, for example, shared and open spaces and how those will be utilised. So obviously in the normal world, when you have students on site for face-to-face teaching, we have cafes and open spaces and areas where students congregate. One of the big concerns is in terms of students' experience, how that's, from a social distancing point of view, it's much more challenging. So we're looking at things like having trained student ambassadors to sort of make sure people keep a distance, guide people through. It's all had to be very carefully looked at from timetabling. There's a lot of debate about whether 5 hours should be over 1 day or 2 days. But yes, it will. I can sympathise with the comments about. There's a comment particularly about feeling a bit like a ghost town, I think, isn't there? To look like a ghost town. Yeah, Jeffrey's put that in. Working groups preparing for remote, but campus services don't want us to look like a ghost town. And then Jeffrey also mentions about day permits. I'm not sure that isn't something we've talked about. So I don't know. In terms of day permits, that might be a good one to pick up with Jeffrey.
Yeah, I mean, Jeffrey, if you want to come onto the mic and sort of explain a bit more about the situation you're finding at your organisation and how you're trying to address these challenges, that'd be really useful to hear.
My mic has gone green. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hello. Hi, Jeffrey.
Hello. Yes. So as I've said, some people are very concerned that we should be able to provide a campus experience. At the same time, all the messaging coming from the government and the QAA and the Office for Students is about safety first. So we've got to balance these two different expectations, and some of my colleagues are more receptive to one side of that than the other. So some of them are very concerned about the safety, and some are much more concerned about our job as educators, as a university. The difficulty my particular university would have if we did say that we wanted to manage access onto the campus is we've got no realistic way of setting that up. We would have to rely on self-policing and self-responsibility. We couldn't institute, in the time we have, any kind of booking system. We couldn't possibly put marshals on all the gates, even if we thought that was a good idea. So there's going to have to be quite a lot of community education, and we know that our student body understand that they've got quite a big job of work to communicate that to all of the students that this is only going to work if we all look after ourselves and we look after each other. And one aspect of this, of course, is the staff experience. I have colleagues who are simply going to walk off campus if they see things they regard as unsafe, or if they think the common areas aren't being maintained properly, or the walk routes are not safe. So managing the access and setting up expectations for what the environment's going to look like, this has proved for us to be the hardest thing to agree among ourselves even.
What are the mechanisms that you're using to try and sort of communicate, or at least kind of elicit those opinions, but also work with people in dialogue to establish what kind of the best way forward is? Is that something which you've settled on as an organisation?
We've got we have some working groups that are meeting more or less in permanent session, and one of them is about the student experience. But this is where there is a tension that I don't think we're really acknowledging in our institute. So every time somebody says we've got to think about the health and safety on campus and managing the access, I think the students are taking the view, I think the student leaders are taking the view that really it'll be about behavioural modifications. Some of the things that Ashley was talking about, we can welcome everyone onto the campus provided they behave properly, and I think that's the message they want to communicate to the students coming in.
Right.
It's about wearing masks and observing distance, and perhaps being on campus only on the days when you are being taught. But we don't have any way we can police this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree totally, Jeffrey. I think we're having some of the same conversations. There is concern from the point of view of staff policing if a student appears on campus, in particular, say with COVID symptoms. So that is a big concern, and it's a big concern in terms of our accommodation as well. So obviously, if a student does the right thing, self-isolates, they have a way of making that known, and there's support that's available. So all of the messaging and the support is there for them. And in terms of the health and safety messaging, which is being led by our estates team, by a colleague that I work with closely there, in reality, the view is very much you can put up all of the messaging and the posters and the information, but students won't necessarily always adhere to it. So there is that concern. But it is another area where we're going into unknown territory. I think most students will do the right thing and are very socially conscious. And one of the things that we did observe in Coventry, and I don't know if others on the call have had the same, was that we saw a rapid reduction in footfall into our main campus, way ahead of when we went into lockdown. And our communal areas, our food areas, our open and shared spaces became, as you put about a ghost town, they started to look like a ghost town way before we went into official lockdown at government directives. So from February, they were disappearing from campus. We have a high proportion of international students, and for some of those, the parents of the students were much more concerned about the well-being of their students being in England and it being unsafe because they didn't agree that the government was doing enough at the time. So we had international students leaving campus before lockdown as well. And obviously some students couldn't leave when we went into lockdown, and then we did need to put in support, etc., for them through things like food deliveries if they were isolated, etc. But yes, I think the whole thing with COVID is people make their judgments on a personal level around their own risk, and for some staff, they will be very, very nervous of coming into campus, based on if they have their own health issue, or if they need to if they have a relative that lives with them who could be exposed. So we're doing all that we can as well within our people team structure, which is our HR structure, that staff can make their line manager aware, and that we're doing risk assessments for every single team. So the risk assessment has to be done by the manager of every single team, but individual risk assessments where the person is more at risk. And we're also trying to ensure that every member of staff who can work from home will work from home when they can work from home. So I don't know if that helps, though, to explain that.
I think it's a hugely complex area, of course. Probably one of the hardest challenges, I think, is kind of managing what is a hugely complex organizational challenge and a human challenge as well. Thank you for that. I just want to keep things flowing a bit. There's always a bit of a risk when somebody like me comes along and says, well, I'm going to ask these questions and in this particular order, that I sort of break the flow up a bit, or I don't quite hit what people are asking about. So at all times, do kind of say, well, what I really want to know about is this. But just to kind of give us a little bit of a framework to work through for the rest of the session, we've got about 45 minutes left. So what I want to do is to put some questions to you about the situation, and to Ashley as well, of course, who's here. Either to think about the experience that you're in is just around what's already happened, but also thinking about things that you think would be a good idea to do as well, either at an organizational level or just from your own personal opinion. So to begin with, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in. Hopefully, you should see a new chat window that's opened up next to the question on the slide. If somebody could give me a green tick, just to let me know that I've worked this properly. Yes, thank you, people. Thank you very much. Okay, so I was going to start this with a question about sort of issues, but in a sense, I wonder whether that's a bit of a negative way to start on this one, and whether a different question about innovation and kind of what steps we think we can take to help people to learn and work and protect physical and mental well-being whilst on campus. So if I can throw this over to the room here. Obviously, there are lots and lots of different areas. It might be to do with student services, it might be to do with teaching and learning or accommodation, library services, and so on. Just by way of brainstorm, or just to elicit some ideas from the group, what innovative steps can we take, could we take as a sector to help people to basically to get that safe return to campus? What are the things that you're trying already or you think could be a good idea to try? I'll let things go quiet just for a little bit because it takes people a bit of time to think and to type. Okay, some interesting things coming in here. I also noticed Jeffrey's put an interesting one in the main chat window as well. Just I want to reflect a little bit on Dee Casement's comment early on about survey students. Do they want a campus or an online experience? I wonder if that is something which organisations have tried, what they've learnt from that as well. There was a really interesting article in Wonk HE, which if you're from outside the UK is a sort of an online magazine looking at kind of policy and leadership within the higher education sector, which I think has got some really useful insights, which I've just kind of dropped into the chat there, which might be worth a look at. Yes, I like that. I like the cheerful face coverings as well. Actually, my COVID mask has got Daffy Duck on it. I think there's a lot to be said for that. But let's have a look through some of the things that people have been saying. So there's a bit there about kind of COVID testing on campus, which both Claire and Jeffrey have talked about. Dinosaurs and train face masks, brilliant. I mean, to be honest, I mean, my specialism is in digital practice. I wouldn't kind of know where to start with that. Is that something that a lot of people are trying or are looking at? What are the logistical challenges, I wonder, of achieving that at scale? Okay, just letting some people type away there. I'll pick out some other interesting points here. Both Amy and Mark Hayton, Mark's my colleague at Jisc, have mentioned this idea about kind of self-sufficient bubbles on campus. And actually, that's what my son's, he's 13, so he's not at university yet, but that's kind of how they've been managing their gradual phased return and doing it, years at a time with bubbles, and that seems to have worked quite well for them. But logistically, it's quite a challenge to achieve that. But gives you, I guess, it would give you sort of a certain amount of control, and maybe the beginnings of a kind of a track and trace situation as well. Amy's also talking about sort of clear communication about all university plans for returning to campus. So, and that was sort of making me think back to what Ashley was talking about preparing the community and preparing the infrastructure, and this communication challenge, I guess as well, about being, is there a single source of truth on your campus? Where do people know they can go somewhere to get reliable information?
I like all of these ideas are really good about the health and wellness and social online events to keep connected. Mm-hmm. I think those are some really brilliant ideas there.
I mean, what I particularly like about those is obviously the challenge of self-policing that Jeffrey was talking about. It's trying to influence behaviour in a very diverse population that's sometimes difficult to communicate with, and you could foresee that there might be some institutions or some people that try to think, well, no, coercion is the wrong word. What am I talking about? It's compliance with certain standards, and trying to enforce that. But I think what a lot of people seem to be talking about here is something a bit more positive. It's about sort of getting a movement and socializing it, and actually turning it into part of student life and students' identity, which I really like.
I think those ideas would be brilliant as well for students that are arriving. Mm-hmm. For the first time. I think one of the biggest challenges that we are foreseeing in Coventry is students arriving who are international students who may need to quarantine for 2 weeks. And some of those students could be very young students, first time away from home. Sometimes they're under 18. So anything that could be done that will ensure they feel supported, and any sort of activity that will reduce the anxiety, I think would be absolutely brilliant. I really like these ideas.
Yeah, yeah. I'm wondering a little bit about physical space as well, and maybe with a bit of a digital slant on it, but think about innovative ways of using the physical space that you've got on campus as well. I mean, I suppose the social bubbles bit is part of that, but I'm just curious to know whether that's something other people are looking at as well.
So in Coventry, we're looking to deliver our mental health and wellbeing sessions face-to-face and online. I'm interested to know if people are doing the same. So currently they are still available all online, but sessions will be available through appointments after September. I'm wondering if people are doing that as well.
Kevin's comment at the end there was interesting about having examined bubbles recently while writing Return to Teaching on Campus document. That sounds, from what Kevin said, that they would need to include many other measures to work effectively. Kevin, I just wonder whether, if you're able to grab the microphone, if you could sort of expand a little bit on that for us, and just, what other measures, what are the other dependencies that are going on there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Hi.
Yeah. Well, basically, I've just been writing a document for returning to campus. Because safety at our university is actually taking a lead on a lot of these things. And I did look at the bubble model, what was, I think, came from a New Zealand document that I read, but the complexities and how that would be managed effectively at a university the size of ours, where you have bubbles that are isolated, they can't interact with other bubbles, different category risk levels from 5 to 1, where social distancing measures are reduced or increased. Just meant that behaviour was also another big issue of people. And I think it would be, like you mentioned earlier, it would need track and trace elements. It would need proper management procedures to be in place, which everybody adhered to, and communication lines between staff, students, postgraduate demonstrators, facilities directorate. Everything would actually have to be stronger than they currently are. So there are lots and lots of failure points even with that bubble method. So I think, again, it's sometimes reliance on something which we think is a good idea, but then when you actually try and put it into practice, you then hit that many brick walls that effectively it doesn't actually add to anything. It actually detracts, and then people go into a false sense of comfort zone, and then it could lead to some sort of outbreak or stuff because of that. So that's just what I thought with the bubble model. So I chose to leave it out on at this point, but obviously I'm looking through that to see if how effectively we can simplify it and probably make it work. But it was like banging my head against a brick wall when I was looking at different scenarios and different elements of when you can mix bubbles together, ratio staff to students, how then students and staff just align with that group, etc., etc. So there's just a myriad of failure points.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting. I don't know whether you've got a link to that New Zealand document, whether you'd be able to share that in the, if it's something that is shareable, whether you could drop it into the chat with us. That would be.
Well, I won't be able to do it now, but I can send it to you, and then you can distribute it later.
Thank you. Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks very much for that. Thanks, Mark. Yes, physical bubbles, actually surrounding people in Zorb balls, you know, so that you
Well,
have
we
to
call
roll
them
around campus.
pods. We called them pods, not bubbles.
Just, I do want to move on to the next question, but there's just something that's been bubbling around in my mind since Ashley was talking about dashboards and just thinking about data and sort of intelligent campus. I know the idea of intelligent campus and using data from spaces to monitor their use and increase their effectiveness. That's still something that's probably in its infancy. At least at the campus level. I mean, you might find so within libraries it's very well tuned. But I just wonder what are people's organisations using data from spaces and data from sensors or sort of movement tracking as part of this picture, or is that something which is, you know, just not yet? We're not ready for that. And Maureen, I will. Yes, I'm going to pick up on that question about libraries actually in a second. Thank you, Amy, for that. Posting Harvard's libraries draft plan. That'll be an interesting read. Thank you. Yeah, so this, I mean, the thing about libraries is really interesting because we've also had people mentioning things about resources and helping people get used to the idea of online resources as well. So, you know, where you can reduce demand on the physical space, but still using the services and the resources at hand. You know, some of that is going to take, you know, some of that there might be a technological fix for that in terms of setting up systems, but there's also helping people to kind of understand what's available, helping with study skills, online study skills, and so on. But there's some interesting things coming in here about library space. So I'm just going to let that flow for a little bit, and then we'll move on. Okay, just while Emma is finishing typing that, don't rush, Emma. Don't worry. I'm just going to drop the next question just for you to start thinking about into the main chat window. So in a second I'll bring this up. Don't answer it yet. Just have a think. But it's thinking about kind of what established practice will need to change in order to achieve the goal of a safe return to campus. And maybe it's a little bit broader than practice. Maybe it's about kind of assumptions as well. Maybe even about core values. So just to reflect on what Emma's typed there, there's a mega strain on Samaritans right now due to COVID, and psychology and psychiatry aren't taking new referrals. So a lot of people are in the dark. So it will highly benefit a lot of people for counselling in the institution to be running. So yeah, a really important plea there for student support services, particularly from the mental health wellbeing side of things. Okay. Thank you. I will. What's going to be the best way of doing this? Because people are going to want to keep typing in there. I will have to move on just because time is a little tight. We do want to finish at 3. So, Orion, I'm sorry. I know you're typing. I am going to shift us on to the next one. So, I'm just going to park the chat back over here and open up a new chat window. So like I said, don't just think practice. Think values, assumptions, core principles as well. You know, what are the kind of the big picture things? So we talked a little bit about kind of innovative fixes for things, but maybe what's the established practice stuff, the established values and assumptions, things that perhaps we'll also need to change in order to achieve our goal of a safe return to campus. I mean, maybe just to inspire a little bit of thinking about that. I know some people are typing at the moment, so thank you for that. But I did notice on Twitter yesterday, Edinburgh University are sort of leading into pointing out to people about, perhaps addressing the debate about quality, the expectation of the quality of learning, particularly if you are going to be experiencing a lot of online learning where you thought you were going to be getting it face to face. And they just recorded a small animated video, which is kind of setting the scene for what online learning is, and what might be different about it, but what is the same about it, and the fact that you're still part of the same community, you're still learning from the same people. I just thought it was interesting that they're sort of leading with that and trying to address it head on, rather than try to. I don't know. What am I trying to say here? The attitudes towards learning face-to-face and online, people have different expectations for it, and that can be a challenge to try and address. So it was just interesting to see what their approach to that was. So in a way, Amy's point there about you have to be in person to establish constructive relationships with students and building the community maybe is part of that as well. I have to know more about Couch to College. That sounds ace. So Orion's point, we're doing Couch to College and virtual tours for SEN, sign language, online induction to the libraries before we, I think, is that before we blind? I'm not sure. Orion, do you want to tell us a little bit about how that idea came to be? Blind and with digital, right. Again, if anybody wants to pick up the microphone and talk about just kind of how they're seeing their institution grapple with this idea about established practice and established ideas. Sorry, I just had a sort of minor heart attack there when my screen went blank because I hadn't moved my mouse for so long that my computer went into lockdown. But I hope you can still hear me. So we've got a few things in here. So yeah, this kind of couch to college thing sounds brilliant. I love it as a brand name. Particularly having done Couch to 5K in my time for running. Decasements, talking about consideration for other people and the unknowns, i.e. they may be vulnerable to shielding, or teaching staff may be vulnerable to shielding, and face-to-face may not be possible or feasible. Claire's point about buildings, well, yeah, maybe the established practice is actually built into the fabric of the world around you. So repurposing buildings and space based on that is going to be challenged because it's a bricks and mortar issue as well. Decasement, also mentions induction. It's interesting that the last webinar that we ran was actually around induction, and we followed this sort of principle of putting questions out to the community. And my colleague Zach Gribble, again working with Chris Gormley, who's on this call, put together this guide around planning for induction for autumn 2020, which I think tries to address some of these. So by all means, have a look at that. Yeah. So this idea about, I mean, space has always been a scarce resource on a lot of campuses. That's now much more acute, so the need for low density of space for teaching and isolation and a protocol to deal with quote space now full situations, sort of implying a level of self-policing that will need to be instilled. I mean, does anybody? Again, Jeff, it would be useful to know a little bit more about that. But I'm just thinking about ways of kind of establishing, using kind of space data, check-in data, for example, or some way of flagging up. How can we sort of flag up to students that certain spaces are full at particular times, and sort of addressing the information about, what's the alternative for. So if you couldn't make it to this seminar or this lecture or this lab session. Mm-hmm.
It's Jeffrey here. I'm just speaking on
Hi,
this
Jeffrey.
question about this and the circulation of people around the space. The difficulty I'm meeting with my colleagues is that no one wants to be the bogeyman. No one wants to say, I am taking charge of this question in my building on this campus, and I am declaring that on this day, only 20% of people will come, and these are the 20% who can come. And this is the protocol when the space is full, and here is the overspill space for those people to go to, because they've travelled to campus. We don't want them to be disappointed. People are finding it quite hard to picture this concretely. And in fact, I don't know what people on the call think about this, but I think there's quite a lot of magical thinking. I think some people are hoping that it will all just go back to normal and that we won't have to make these difficult decisions where I am in charge of this building and I'm saying, you can't come in here, or you've got to walk this way, or this room is now full. Those are the kinds of things we'll need to be doing if we are going to have either teaching or campus services opening. And nobody among my colleagues really wants to be that person.
Yeah, no, I can absolutely see that. Can I just, I want to bring in this just because I'm thinking back to the question that I asked right at the start here about kind of how, how people were approaching this. And a couple of people mentioned hybrid learning, where you do have this situation where it's down to the choice, at least the way that I read hybrid learning is that you have an element of choice as a student as to kind of which mode you engage with, whether it's sort of online or something which is campus based and physically face-to-face present. For those people that are doing that, are you building into those courses ways for people to sort of register what their intention is? So you've got, or finding some way of getting intelligence as to kind of how many people you're expecting on campus at any one time. Is that something which systems will allow? I'm just curious about that. So in addition to being able to kind of say that this is the space limit on something and it is now full, so therefore you need to go for option B, as it were, so you're not disappointed having travelled all the way to campus. But is there a way of perhaps already knowing what the balance is likely to be if you are doing that hybrid learning approach? just while people are having to think about that, yeah, Claire, it was actually the lifts thing that Jeffrey, you mentioned earlier, sort of other pinch points in the system as well. Public transport actually actively getting to campus, that needs to be thought out as well. Sorry, Jeffrey, I interrupted you there. You were saying something.
No, sorry, it's hard to know when it's your turn in these systems. This thing about people signaling their intentions, we actually do that in a way with our online courses. So we have some totally online courses at the moment. We have some experience in this space. And the students do a lot of work offline. And then at the end of the week, there is a seminar on Zoom or Teams. And we ask students to signal whether they're going to take part in that live seminar, because there's no point in assigning them to a group task or a group project during the week if they're not going to attend the live seminar. And I think you could easily extend that to a campus experience. You could say, okay, here is the beginning of the week. Here's my micro lecture to set up the week of learning that you're doing. With those of you who want to book for the session at the end of the week or in the middle of the week, please sign up here. Spaces are limited. We will take the first 20 people. The camera will be on the session for those of you who want to watch from home. We're not doing that, but that seems to me to present no more technical problems than asking people to signal their intentions for an online course. Yeah,
no, that's interesting. I also wonder whether there's maybe there's a priority booking thing strand to that as well. I mean, particularly if anybody on the call has got an interest in kind of widening participation, accessibility, and inclusion, and so on, whether there are certain students that can be identified as being actually that maybe they get first dibs on actually coming in physically if they need to. Whether that's something to bake into that sort of planning system as well. The other, I will need to move on in a second. I'm just going to pre-post the next question into the main block of chat, just so you know what's coming. We're just thinking about kind of infrastructure policy and processes. Oh, thank you, Claire. Yes, I was thinking exactly of that QAA taxonomy for digital learning. It's probably no more than just a prompt for thoughts or ideas at this stage, but thinking about the way the curriculum is designed, where we're thinking about kind of established practice and expectations around that. Excuse me, I just need to clear my throat one moment. And what a blended or an online or a hybrid curriculum might look like, and how much it's based around, say for example, the tentpole event of a lecture, and actually whether that's something that's in order for all this to happen, that's maybe one of the things that needs to be addressed. That actually, if you're going to deliver things online or in a blended or hybrid format, breaking away from the idea of a 50-minute live or face-to-face or recorded lecture into something which is a bit more sort of broken up, or something which uses the affordances of online space and asynchronous learning a bit more effectively. I'm going to leave that one there at the moment. We're going to move on to our final question. Just maybe sort of just a brief bit of time on this one. Thank you very much for your responses so far, by the way. This has been great. I guess this is more thinking about the how, and particularly, we are Jisc, so we've got an interest in the digital side of things as well. But just kind of thinking about what changes, as opposed to changes to practice and to values and assumptions. Well, what about changes to digital infrastructure, policy, and processes? Do we need to make to enable the return of staff and students? So if you're thinking about, well, what are the top priority things you think your institution has got to address in terms of refitting the way things work, the structures within the organization to create an environment to allow all the other stuff to happen? I mean, given that Learning, Teaching, Reimagined is a program which is aimed at kind of senior leadership, I mean, this is perhaps kind of another one of those areas that senior leaders in particular have got a big role to play in terms of setting the background. So we'll spend about sort of 10 minutes or so on this question. I'll just go quiet again for a while people are typing. Just to reflect a bit on the two things that have come in there, one from Oreen and one from Jeffrey there. I mean, I think from Oreen's point about a mobile phone shortcut to the library website, I think it's an interesting challenge to think about how, to use the web design phrase, how responsive your systems are, your web systems are. So if people are trying to access website or services and the only method they've got for doing that is via a mobile phone, and we have heard over the course of the lockdown that for a lot of people that is their device. They don't have access to a laptop, they don't have access to a tablet, it's a phone. They'll be doing their learning through their phone. So have you as an organization set up your resources so that they are accessible and usable to your students. Jeffrey, just to kind of pick up on your point about this cultural problem about seeing COVID as a blip. I mean, I'll bracket this off and saying this is kind of my personal view. This is not necessarily the Jisc view. And actually, it was something I put in a blog post that I did with two of my colleagues, Liz Purcell and Zach Gribble, which we published yesterday. Which I think, and you mentioned this term kind of magical thinking, that all things will be well a little bit earlier. But it's my opinion that the level of the shocks to the system that we've had, because it's been so systemic, and it's not just a shock to education but the whole society, that the hope that things will return to quote normal, as in what it was like pre-lockdown, is perhaps missing the point. That the landscape will have changed quite considerably. Sorry, my computer just died again. The landscape will have changed considerably as a result of that systemic shock. So, there will be things that will have changed irretrievably. So, the hope that things will go back to normal. Maybe there will be plenty of things that we want to retain and we want to get back to because they were valuable, and but I hope that things will kind of return to exactly as it was before, perhaps might be unproductive. That's my personal view. So Kevin's talking there about timescales required for change to happen, specifically resourced and funded digital learning. So maybe the expectations about kind of what is achievable within what timeframes, which is an interesting point. Claire, this idea about digital poverty and addressing that. If the learning, teaching, and assessment is going to happen, then making sure that people have the resources and the wherewithal, the opportunities. It's not necessarily just a digital poverty. It can be space poverty, time poverty as well. In talking to your students, is one of the messages we've had consistently from our members over the course of lockdown has been the need to listen to students, their authentic experience, and particularly to the voices of students that don't necessarily get heard all that much. So yeah, I think it's a really good point to bring up, Claire. Liz taking a hard look at reading lists, as we can't assume that usual reading is available online affordably or at all. Close and speedy dialogue between academics and library. Thanks for that, Liz. That's good. So, Aureen, that's a really good news story there. Actually, having sort of convinced students and tutors over the last 4 months to use online with extra coaching. So, the support, giving the support to people so that actually getting in there and using the online resources that are available to them. I'm really glad to hear that. Jeffrey's point there about want to preserve priority for space for labs, clinics, practical and studio subjects. Yeah, and particularly in sort of the creative and scientific sectors, I guess, and engineering. Flexibility to pivot back to online if there's another lockdown. But that was one of the questions that I know Ashley was quite keen to sort of find out about. So were people sort of looking at systems where you could kind of roll forward and roll back according to what the circumstances are? And that's a fairly massive challenge. So this isn't going to be a linear process of great, Orion, thanks for posting that link. It's not going to be sort of a linear process of gradually getting back in. There may be rolling back, and that's a technical challenge, but it's also going to be a human challenge as well. Just having a look through some of these as well. John, by the way, if you're sort of John's my co-pilot today, John Sumter. I've sort of asked him to be on hand in case because sometimes it's quite easy to kind of miss important things that run past. So, John, do let me know if you think I'm missing any points or if you've got any observations about any of this as well. So yeah, some people sort of talking there about people sort of learning in small flats and sharing IT equipment, where it's this idea of kind of relative digital poverty or absolute digital poverty and space poverty. There's obviously a big thing in here. And there's an important point in there about well-being as well, about not using digital. Students can't interact with the screens all day long, and perhaps they don't have to as well. That's the thing. If depending on, I guess maybe it's a curriculum design thing, but thinking about the overall picture of kind of what's the rhythm of your student's day going to be. How much time are you expecting them to spend online? What can they be doing away from it? What can they be doing in open spaces, for example? That might be an interesting thing to address. Just having a look at the last point there about local government can activate lockdowns if spike occurs and management of COVID-19 is not seen as adequate. Yeah, so this kind of targeted sort of micro level lockdowns is a possible thing, and also very hard to. If you've got a university which is an active part of its local population, which I think all of them are, that's going to be a massive challenge to address. Claire's asked an interesting question there about kind of what extent can learning analytics help us in this new context. I wonder if I could just maybe sort of in the final minutes of the session just kind of open that one out to people and just is there anyone we can link to or any other organisations or people in the call that have a particular eye on the way they're using learning analytics and maybe curriculum analytics to help with this. Managing the return, or at least getting a sense of kind of what people are doing and how they're engaging. Thanks, Claire. That's a good nod for Northumbria, just down the road from me. I'm in Newcastle, by the way. I might sound Scottish, but I actually live in Newcastle. Oh, I'm glad the Jisc content for childcare videos has worked brilliantly for the cohort. That's good news. That's good news. Okay. What I'm going to suggest is, because we're at time, and I know people will need to get, because we've had your attention for an hour and a half, which I can't thank you more for. That's been great. And there's been a huge amount of information which you've shared today, and a lot for us to kind of look back over. And I'm sorry we haven't sort of addressed in depth all the points that have been made here. What I will say is that we do have a coronavirus online community, which John, I haven't got it ready, John. Sorry, if you could do a bit of digging for me and drop into the chat the link to our kind of coronavirus area. We've got a Teams community which we use for kind of keeping these sorts of conversations going. So if there's things that you want to address to, there's 900 people in this community, so there's a lot of people to talk to. So please do to drop that in. Let me just kind of start rounding things up by sort of moving on to our final no, actually, before we do that, I've just got one thing to do. Just a bit of an announcement. About what's happening next for the Learning, Teaching, Reimagined program. We have an upcoming webinar this time next week, actually, or just same day, different time, which is actually going to be hosted by the Open University, which is about moving learning online. It's an event that the OU have been doing with a number of different organisations, and very kindly agreed to do it with us as well, and to do it online. So I'd highly recommend you coming along for that event. There's a link for it in the chat window that John has just put in for me. Thank you very much indeed. Also, the Learning and Teaching Reimagined space, we've got a dedicated online community now, actually as part of the Advanced HE's Connect platform as well. So if you want to continue the conversation from a kind of senior leadership learning teaching point of view, then there's a community which is growing within the Advanced HE area, which John just put a link into. We'll be sharing more details of that in the future, but if you want to go and start exploring it now, the link is in there at the moment. And if you want to keep up to date with the program, please do sign up to Jisc Headlines or the fortnightly newsletter, which you can do by going to that website there, jisc.ac.uk/headlines, or even just kind of put your name in the chat, and we'll add you to the list if you want to. So that's what's happening next. We probably don't have any extra time for Q&A. I'm going to hang around for a little while. So if there's things that you kind of think, actually, no, we would still like a bit more information on such and such, then please do put something into the Q&A box, which has appeared down the bottom there. We're really keen to get your feedback. So there's a feedback form, which I think will pop up automatically when you leave the room, but if you want to start having a go at it now, it's really important to us to know how well we kind of meet people's expectations with these events, considering they're ongoing. So please do feed that in there. I'll also leave this up because there's some web links in there to useful information about coronavirus, communities, to the slides as well for this event, and to information about the next webinar. So thank you once again. Thank you especially to Ashley for coming along and being such a great part of this session and giving us an insight into what's going on at your institution.
Sorry about the tech issues at the start.
Not at all, not at all. Just a minor blip. Thanks to John, Edwards, and Teresa for sort of helping the session to run smoothly today, and to Chris Gormley as well, who's going to help us put all this together into something that we can share as a resource. So that's been brilliant. Thank you, everybody, and hopefully we shall see you in future webinars. But that's it for today. Thank you. Have a great rest of the week, and yeah, we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye, Ashley.
Bye.